Hello. Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Marcia Wagner. I am the founder and the principal of the Wagner Law Group. Thank you so much for joining us today. One of my goals when founding the Wagner Law Group more than 25 years ago, time flies when you're having fun, was to provide cutting-edge legal and business advice to our clients, especially during challenging times. These are certainly challenging times in the human resources and in the employment law fields. That is why my esteemed colleagues and good friends, Katherine Brustowicz and David Gabor, are going to be spending the next hour with you, speaking about recent and significant developments. This program will be, I think, extremely insightful, and it is my expectation that you and I will gain valuable knowledge and information to help you and your organizations going forward. David Gabor is the head of our employment and HR practice and has more than 30 years of experience in litigating employment law cases and in counseling clients on employment and on HR issues. One of David's strengths is the training programs he has put together to keep our clients informed and in compliance and thriving. Katherine Brustowicz's practice focuses on employment law and on human resources. She has significant experience and expertise with litigation at the trial and at the appellate court levels. Katherine also counsels clients on a wide variety of HR issues, and she is just a resource, a gem. She creates and conducts impartial, impactful trainings, and several of which I believe she will be discussing today for you. So with that, David, Katherine, the floor is yours, and I can't wait to hear what you have to inform us.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And Katherine, thank you for participating in the program today. Marcia, you're right. It has been an unprecedented time and so challenging for employers and employees. It is almost as though we are enduring the perfect storm. Think of the hashtag #MeToo movement, racial injustice issues, the pandemic, remote workforces, the Great Resignation, and tensions between employees regarding vaccination and politics in the workplace, like we have never seen before. Katherine and I are going to spend the next hour talking about some of these challenges, and we are also going to talk about recommendations, steps that you can take to not only be compliant, but to also be proactive. So we're going to talk about the pandemic, the Great Resignation, although I'm not quite sure why it's called great, it's actually horrible, policies and training for remote and hybrid teams, employee classification and equal pay, and the new program at the EEOC called Hiring Initiatives and Recognize Equity, HIRE. So let's get this program started. Next slide, please. And Katherine, we have all heard so much about the pandemic, in fact, for 22 months now. So I have a rhetorical question for you. Has anything happened recently regarding the pandemic and its impact on employers and employees?
Thanks, David. Yes, a lot has happened. That's actually an understatement, to say the least. To start with, I want to discuss both of the January 13th, 2022 Supreme Court decisions. The first is in regards to OSHA's emergency temporary standard, the shot or test mandate. In staying the rule, the SJC stated that the mandate is not a workplace safety standard, but rather a broad public health measure, and that, quote, although COVID-19 is a risk that occurs in many workplaces, it is not an occupational hazard in most, end quote. So essentially, the court's take was that Congress's intention was not for OSHA to make sweeping policies of this variety through mandates. The COVID-19 shot or test mandate is actually being withdrawn today, January 26, 2022, by the United States Labor Department's Workplace Safety Agency. Large employers, so those with 100 or more employees, are not mandated to institute a shot or test policy. They're no longer required to track vaccination status, require masks or social distancing, or to test their employees. Also, just yesterday, which was the 25th of January, OSHA announced that it will no longer seek to enforce the ETS. But keep in mind that the temporary directive also served as the proposal to a permanent rule. OSHA doesn't have a set date for finalizing that permanent rule, but it's important to keep your eyes open and anticipate that OSHA will be proposing permanent COVID-19 safety standards. That actually brings me to an important point that David and I are going to mention quite a few times throughout this program. It is incredibly important to keep up to date on ongoing developments. This COVID-19 landscape is constantly shifting on what seems to be a daily basis. And the laws and regulations also vary somewhat dramatically from state to state and among different localities. So the information that we're sharing with you is current as of right now. But by the end of the week or the end of the month, there's a high chance that we'll have seen further changes and developments. So please remain diligent. I also want to mention that OSHA fully intends to enforce the general duty clause. OSHA can still issue workplace hazard citations under the general duty clause, so keep that in mind. Employers must provide a work environment free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So employers do remain responsible for ensuring workplace safety. The Omicron variant has led to a threefold increase in worker complaints and referrals to OSHA from other agencies. In the first 17 days of 2022, OSHA received 702 complaints. To put that jump into perspective, in November, OSHA was receiving only 70 complaints weekly. Efforts such as indoor mask wearing, social distancing, improved ventilation, and perhaps physical partitions can still help to keep the workplace safe. There's also recent data showing that N95 or KN95 masks provide far superior protection than cloth or surgical masks do. To that end, Los Angeles' Unified School District is now requiring their students to wear masks that are non-cloth and have a nose wire to help the mask fit securely. Tips of this variety should be shared by employers so your workforce is better informed on how they can keep themselves safer. So in addition to sharing knowledge, what can employers do now? An excellent option is to implement their own vaccination policy, even though some are not required to do so. Court rulings to date confirm that employers can lawfully mandate vaccination as a condition of employment. That's at the pre-hire and post-offer stage. Of course, employers are subject to the same reasonable accommodation obligations under the ADA and Title VII. So exemptions must be granted to employees who have sincerely held religious beliefs or observances or disability. Also in regards to reasonable accommodations, we've seen that courts are more willing to view remote work as a reasonable accommodation than they had been prior to the pandemic. Remote work is a great option when it's compatible with the essential functions of the job, but remote work is not practical for all jobs or industries. What else can employers do now? Employers should continue to enforce COVID-19 and other safety policies. Help to combat the Great Resignation by letting your employees know that you care about their safety. David is going to go into a lot of detail regarding the Great Resignation a bit later on in our program. If you're not comfortable implementing a voluntary mandate, at the very least, consistently enforce mask wearing policies, consider increasing the airflow in the building, in the office, and ensure that your workforce maintains social distancing. Doing nothing is no longer an option. Employers need to navigate requirements set at the federal, state, local, and industry levels. Some states and localities have social distancing requirements in place and mask wearing in public places, like most of the northeastern states. But there are 11 states with laws or regulations that limit or prohibit employers from implementing vaccine mandates. Alabama, Florida, Kansas, Texas, and Utah, to name a few. To some extent, the rules and procedures are all over the map. So it's imperative that you keep up to date on your state's rules. Later in the program, we delve into a discussion of remote workforce considerations and keeping apprised of which state your workers are all physically working from. That will be very important. More on that soon. As you make a decision regarding the next steps that you will take to ensure a workplace free from unsafe working conditions, consider the impact that an employer's approach has on the team, on employee engagement, morale, and the impact on the community. The SJC's decision to block the shot or test mandate brought about feelings of relief for some and fear and disappointment for others. The second SJC decision, rendered on the same day, has been received more positively. David, would you mind sharing an update with us about the healthcare workers mandate?
Sure, thank you, Catherine. But before we do so, there was one question in the chat. The guidance you just gave, is that true for federal contractor employers who are not mandated at this point to have a shot or test mandate?
I'm sorry, David, could you repeat the question? Is it that?
Sure, the question is the federal mandate executive order for federal contractors to vaccinate all employees on hold now? Do federal contractor employers need to do anything at this time?
That's a great question. We're going to be addressing that mandate in a few slides. And not to be a terrible spoiler here, but no, that federal contractor mandate is not in effect at the moment. There's no obligation for federal contractors, but I will definitely delve into that with more detail on the 6th slide.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the second decision that came down on January 13th impacts employees and employers at Medicare and Medicaid certified providers and suppliers. In this case, the Supreme Court allowed the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to move forward with its COVID-19 vaccination directive. Covered employers must implement a mandatory vaccination policy that includes a process for workers to request an exemption for medical or religious reasons consistent with Title VII and the ADA. There will be no test out option for unvaccinated workers. The only exception would be for a religious or medical exemption. Employers are also responsible for tracking and securely documenting vaccination status. In addition, employers need to implement a process to ensure additional precautions to prevent the transmission of COVID, things such as social distancing. The good news for these employers is that the deadlines have been adjusted. There's a group 1, and these are the states that have not been involved in litigation regarding this directive. They have a deadline of January 27 for their workers to receive their first COVID-19 vaccine dose, and they also have that deadline for their written vaccination policies and procedures, which need to be not only developed, but implemented. The deadline for full vaccination is February 28, 2022. Then there's a group 2, and these are the following states: Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Their deadline for the first shot and the creation of their policies and procedures is February 14. Not quite sure why they picked Valentine's Day, but they did. Then the deadline for full vaccination is March 15, 2022. The third group, which consists solely of Texas, has a deadline of February 22 for the first COVID dose and the development and implementation of their vaccine dose and vaccine policies. March 21 is the deadline for full vaccination. Believe it or not, Katherine, this will cover roughly 17 million workers. So Katherine, if you can jump ahead and share some other emerging trends that folks need to consider.
Gladly. So here we are. Here are a few issues to definitely keep an eye on. And this actually circles back to the previous question that was asked. This is the federal contractor mandate. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the mandate, but it's definitely important to note that the Presidential Executive Order 14042 essentially had required federal contractors to be vaccinated, but the rule has been blocked for the time being. The federal government cannot currently enforce the federal contractor mandates against federal contractors. I suspect that over the next several months, this will be readdressed by the court, but at the moment, it seems rather unlikely that federal contractors will be required to comply with the mandate until much later this year, if at all. So again, this is why it's so important to do your due diligence, keep up to date on this. At the moment, it has been blocked, but do stay tuned because the landscape will likely shift again. I also wanted to quickly hit upon two COVID-related emerging trends. And the first is health insurance charges for the unvaccinated. While this has not yet become commonplace, it has the potential to become a trend. Nevada is the first state to implement health insurance charges to unvaccinated workers. Beginning in July of 2022, Nevada's health insurance plan for public employees will include a surcharge for covered workers and their adult dependents who are not vaccinated. My read is that this is another incentive to increase vaccination rates without mandating vaccination. For companies who are self-insured, keep an eye out for future developments and guidance as well. Now, while we're discussing insurance, it may be prudent to consider additional coverage for your business. We're seeing very high rates of lawsuits being filed against employers by employees as a direct result of the pandemic. So if you haven't already, now is a good time to contemplate employment practices liability insurance. EPLI coverage would be triggered for discrimination and retaliation claims. So for example, if an employee claims that you, as their employer, failed to accommodate their sincerely held religious belief or medical exemption from a vaccine requirement, then your EPLI coverage would be triggered. And additional insurance to look into would be for business interruption coverage. This insurance coverage is broader than just the pandemic. It can actually cover any number of other reasons for business interruption, such as natural disasters. Okay, enough about insurance for the time being. Let's go ahead and delve into mask mandates. I previously mentioned that some states have mask mandates for indoor public spaces, and I wanted to address one specific example. New York's mandate requiring that masks be worn in indoor public spaces unless a covered business has implemented a vaccination requirement went into effect on December 13th of 2021. And initially, the mandate was temporary, and it was going to be reevaluated in the middle of January. The governor, however, has extended the mask or vaccine requirement for an additional 2 weeks until at least February 1st of 2022. I would not be surprised if this was extended further while Omicron is still running rampant. And again, I really can't reiterate the importance of this next point enough, but do keep well informed of federal and state guidance as well as developments and litigation. It's really important to stay current because this is so fluid. David, now that we've discussed some emerging trends in the COVID-19 arena, could you please give us some concrete steps that employers can take regarding their workplace policies?
Sure, thank you, Catherine. And you are so right that we need to keep abreast on what's going on because it seems like every day we're getting a new directive, a regulation, an idea for best practice, or a major decision coming from a court somewhere around the country. But one of the most important things employers can do is have a clear policy regarding the pandemic, COVID-19, and other potential issues that could arise, whether it's another disease or a natural disaster. Think of the Hurricane Sandy that ravaged New York back in 2011, things along those lines. Have policies, make it clear to your employees what your policy is, why you have the policy, that you care, and make it very clear what is expected of them and what they can expect of you. What I'm going to talk about now, I am not taking sides with respect to being vaccinated or not being vaccinated or being a Republican or a Democrat, just an example of good, sound policy making. First of all, draft the policy, make it a written policy. We've come across several instances recently where we're working with companies that don't have a written policy, it's verbal, and that can create a host of issues, confusion, and potentially litigation. So the policy should make sense for your team in your industry and in your locations. Remember, the rules that apply to your employees are where they work, not necessarily where you're headquartered. For example, we can have a business in Atlanta that's got employees in 12 different states. So the policy should be at least meeting the minimal requirements where all of the employees work. And this is not stagnant because these requirements can change. So as Catherine alluded to, keep abreast of what's happening in each of the states and sometimes municipalities where your employees work. Things can change on a dime. And then disseminate the policy and keep in mind that messaging is critical. Don't lose the opportunity to make it clear to the employees that you are not merely checking a box. You've created this policy after a ton of consideration. Take it into consideration what is best for the safety, health, and well-being of the team as well as the business. This messaging is critical because it's part of the process of shifting the perception so that employees genuinely believe that you want to make this a great place to work and that safety is a priority. Now, I mentioned an acknowledgement form because this is an excellent way to stress what is expected of the employees. For example, they are not just acknowledging that they received your policy, but they are also agreeing to make you aware if the employee tests positive for COVID or is exposed to someone with COVID or who has concerns that that person may have been exposed to COVID. Make this clear in the acknowledgement, have the employee sign the acknowledgement, and put that in a file, maintaining that as part of your documentation for record-keeping purposes. Now, make a decision with respect to your vaccination and or testing requirements. Again, as I said before, this is not a political message, but do decide on the steps that you as an employer are taking and what you expect of your employees. At the very least, require that your employees test on at least a weekly basis if they are not fully vaccinated, and are working with other employees in or outside the office. Either way, language such as, quote, in order to provide for a safe work environment for our employees and visitors, we require that all employees are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Consider adding the boosters as well, and provide proof of vaccination by, we put a deadline in the policy, or submit to weekly COVID-19 testing, close quote, and then describe how that testing process would be handled in your business. Social distancing rules are also something that should be set forth in the policy. Consider ways that your team can socially distance until we are out of the woods from the pandemic. Many companies are no longer holding conferences at all, while others allow less than half as many people into the conference room for conferences. The policy should also address how many people are in the kitchen and the restrooms, or for that matter, in the office. Once again, this needs to be disseminated. Rules regarding work-related travel. Unfortunately, many employees feel uncomfortable traveling and are relieved if their employer does not require that they travel. Other employees feel safe traveling and actually want to hit the road. Consider the nature of the industry, how many employees you have that do travel for work, and whether or not they are open to travel. You may want to consider some form of an anonymous polling or survey of your employees to get a feel for what they can and cannot do at this time. And then also think about the workplace, things that are specific to your workplace. And this can include policies governing whether visitors need to be showing proof of vaccination before they can enter your facilities, things along those lines. But make this clear in this policy that you disseminate. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to now talk about the Great Resignation. And Catherine, that's slide 8, please. I am not sure why anybody would call it great. I said that earlier, but I can't stress that enough. You see the number 24 million. That's right. 24 million people walked off the job between April and September of 2021. That is an average of 4 million employees per month. The number peaked in November of 2021 when 4.5 million people walked off the job. An extra 1.4 million people were either laid off or were terminated, and an additional 377,000 people had some form of separation from their jobs in November alone, bringing the total to nearly 6 million for that 1 month period. And that figure does not include government workers or farm workers. In preparing for this presentation, in addition to drawing upon the experience working with the companies we work with and talking with colleagues, I also saw a great resource in an article written by MIT Sloan by authors Donald and Charles Sull and Ben Zweig that I do incorporate in the message. Some of the leading factors for the Great Resignation include culture. It's far more impactful, believe it or not, than compensation. And it becomes important when employees feel that they are not respected or if they observe dishonest behavior. Some employees also become concerned if their company is not promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that we'll talk about later on in the program. Communication is another factor. And this comes up a great deal, especially during the pandemic when so many employers pivoted to having employees work remotely, but did not clearly instruct the managers on how to communicate with their teams. So as a result, there are times where the message that is being transmitted is not clear and can lead to conflicting or inconsistent results. Short or cryptic messaging has also been a problem and has created some issues regarding sensitivity that employees have. COVID-19. Many clients have reported that employees are frustrated with how the company handled the pandemic. One concern is the lack of a coherent or a consistent policy. Others report frustration with messaging regarding COVID-19 and what is expected of the teams. Flexibility. This is another factor that has left employees with the belief that the employer is inflexible and intolerant. This arises when employers deny requests to work from home or to perhaps adjust the work schedule because of childcare responsibilities. Granted, not all companies, and certainly not all positions within companies, can be performed from a remote location or can have hours adjusted. However, if a request for flexibility is denied, it is a good idea for the employer to explain why the request was denied and to explore other ways to accommodate the employee, not as a legal obligation under, for example, the ADA or Title VII, which we talked about earlier, but as a demonstration of care and concern for the employees. Job security and changes in the job was actually a surprising factor that's been considered as causing people to leave the job. Employees are sometimes worried about layoffs, a merger, or reorganization. Others do not like change. For example, innovation. Many employers are under the belief that employees would embrace innovation, but in fact, some become scared and start looking for other opportunities or just leave the job. Other factors that are considered are work-life balance, challenges with respect to childcare for their kids, and again, disrespect. So let's talk about the response. Please jump to the next slide. There are steps employers can take to offset unwanted turnover. Before exploring these steps, put yourself in the shoes of the people on your team. And what are some of the things that would be important to you if you were in their shoes? So what can you do? For starters, look at creative benefits that you can offer to your team that are not terribly expensive. I'm not talking about creating a remarkably generous defined benefit plan, or a 401k with huge matching. I'm talking about smaller things you can do, possibly memberships in different organizations, when the time is right and the pandemic subsides, gym memberships, things along those lines are not expensive, but they mean a great deal to employees. So flexibility in scheduling, and we had talked about this just a moment ago, consider remote work, lateral opportunities for employees. Sometimes people would want to change. Instead of working in one position, they can work in another position in the company. And that might be something that's appealing to them. In addition to remote work, consider hybrid work opportunities so that some people can actually continue to work remotely even after the pandemic. That may be incredibly attractive to people on your team. Employees want to be proud. They want to be recognized. And this can be seen both in terms of the type of work that the employees do, as well as in how they are viewed. Think of this. When you meet someone for this first time, they're likely to ask you, so what do you do for work? Where do you work? Hopefully you smile and proudly respond with what you do, where you work, and why you are so proud of the work that you do. That really does matter to people on the team. Team building and social events. Sure, this is a challenge right now during the pandemic, but as the weather gets warmer, think of things that you can do that are outdoors, whether it's a company picnic or getting involved in a charitable event. I used to live in New York and several years attended a March of Dimes event. And in fact, on a couple of occasions, I wore a full-fledged Big Bird costume and walked roughly 10 miles. One year it was incredibly warm and humid out. And the people who I did this with, both from my old firm and some other firms that we did it with and a professional organization, we were really proud of what we were doing. And that brought a great deal of satisfaction, motivation, and engagement to the team. It really was something that was special. Think about surveys and exit interviews. If people are leaving, find out why. Ask questions at that time. Why are you leaving? What were things you liked about the job? What were things that you did not like about the job? If they talk about things they did not like, find out whether they tried to address those issues, either with a manager, human resources, or some executive in the business. And if so, what happened? Use this information to learn so that we can do things better in the future. That would make a very big difference. Respect. And I know this is something that gets repeated in the program, but it's so very important. Think about ways that you can demonstrate that you respect people on the team. If someone does something well, compliment them. Let them know that what they did and that you liked it. Engage, ask suggestions of people. Let them know that their opinion is valued. That will go a long way towards showing that you respect them, gaining their respect. And these are some of the steps that will certainly help in addressing the unwanted turnover. So let's jump ahead. And Katherine, can you walk us through policies and training, especially when some people are working remotely?
Yes, thanks, David. This actually piggybacks quite nicely on your comments about flexibility and scheduling and benefits. So we're going to delve into a discussion about the importance of proper training of newly hired staff, remote staff, and how the process has been impacted by the pandemic. Now, one issue that I've seen frequently over the past 2 years is that many companies haven't updated their employee handbook since COVID hit, and that's a problem. The benefits of having a carefully drafted and updated employee handbook are vast. For employees, a handbook can be a resource and provides guidance regarding the company's policies, procedures, expectations, mission, and benefits. For managers, employee handbooks provide guidelines so that they can treat employees fairly and in a consistent manner. For the company as a whole, provides a layer of employer protection against discrimination or unfair treatment claims. It also helps to meet some legal notice requirements. Now, I would be remiss if I failed to mention that if you're not going to follow the policies that you've outlined in your handbook, or if you're not going to update it regularly, then the handbook can actually be a liability. But if you will update and carefully craft the handbook, it can be an excellent tool and valuable asset. Keep in mind that the most effective employee handbooks are reflective of the organization's expectations, policies, and actual practices. One such policy you should include is your remote work policy. This ties into the next point on the slide. Many managers are still woefully underprepared to lead remote workforces. Effective management with a hybrid or remote workforce requires different skills from the traditional brick and mortar leadership. Managers need to be able to establish goals, monitor their employees' engagement and progress, encourage information and idea sharing, all while supporting connections among colleagues working remotely. One way of succeeding here is by having virtual face-to-face meetings and scheduling regular check-ins with the team. Accountability is really important in this virtual or hybrid model. Now, David mentioned this briefly earlier, but employees need clear direction, clear communication, and they should feel that they can talk to their supervisors to gain clarity, direction, and resources. People naturally want to feel like they're a valuable member of the team, and that can get lost sometimes with remote work. Here's an illustration. Let's say it's Thanksgiving. We have a long table happily full of grown-ups, and then there's the kids' table, which is also full of happy merrymakers. Then we have 1 or 2 people that we just couldn't fit in anywhere else. So they're stuffed into the pantry, seated at a makeshift table on their own. they're bound to feel left out. Similarly, if you have a segment of your workforce physically back working in the office and only a few are working remotely, those remote folks will feel like they've been forgotten in the pantry. A pretty simple solution to combat that isolation is consistent communication. If your team is hybrid, have everyone log into meetings remotely. The perspective that people have of their workplace is critical. So helping people feel like they're on even footing will go a long way. There's also a wide array of legal requirements that management and HR needs to be privy of in this remote and hybrid workforce situation. Out-of-state remote workers create legal risk for employers. And David had touched upon this as well, but I'm going to go into a smidge more detail. An employee working from home in a state different from their physical office location does raise some risk for employers. Employers could become subject to income tax, and in some cases, local or city gross receipts taxes that they were not subject to before. But more fundamentally, from an employment law perspective, employers need to be aware that laws differ drastically from state to state. Issues of overtime, family and medical leave laws, PTO carryover, independent contractor classification, which we will delve into later in this program, unemployment compensation, and workers' compensation, to list a few, should be at the forefront of employers' minds if they have out-of-state employees. Pay particular attention to differences in paid leave laws and anti-discrimination laws. Employers should track their remote workforce's location and require employees to update them with any changes. It's also important to familiarize yourself with the various leave laws and tax laws of those states. Now, beyond managers, many new hires during the pandemic have not received adequate training either. While it's different, it's still equally as important, if not more important, to spend a lot of time onboarding new employees. They don't have the luxury of popping into a colleague's office to ask a quick question about resources. Keep in mind that it can be a little isolating when you join a new company remotely and haven't put names to faces. I encourage the use of Zoom and Microsoft Teams for video chats and virtual meetings. Earlier, I suggested that employee handbooks are a great way to disseminate important information and policies to the entire workforce. That will also help to ensure more centralized and consistent behaviors and responses to employees, which in turn decreases the organization's risk of disparate treatment claims or issues of discrimination. The employee handbook is also the perfect place to include a data privacy policy. This policy should be updated to reflect remote work, keeping in mind that employees may also have access to information and data on their personal devices, laptops, and cell phones, and that will be in their home where family members and others might inadvertently have access. Beyond the employee handbook, another way to make sure the workforce is on the same page is through training. David, let me turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Katherine. And that last point is so very important about protecting the privacy of the information in your system. This may be a requirement, for example, if you're a lawyer and you've got a communication with clients on your computer, or it could be your trade secrets, your proprietary information, the information you've developed over years of hard work. And that can be lost in a moment if somebody is not trained on how to handle these things. So training is something that's got to continue, even with everything else that we're burdened with during this pandemic. Please don't press pause on training. The employment law cases are still going forward, whether they're discrimination, wrongful termination, harassment, wage and hour, all those different areas. They're still moving forward with the cases, so we still need to make sure that we do our best to train our teams. Recently, about a week ago, There was a case that was settled involving the University of Michigan and a doctor that had abused possibly more than 1,000 people, mostly students, over a period of nearly 3 decades. The case settled for, believe it or not, $490 million. Those are reasons enough why we need to go forward with training. So please do not press pause. When you do train, ensure it's interactive. Katherine mentioned using things like Zoom and Teams for doing training if you cannot do it in person, but make it an interactive program. The response I get from people who sit behind a computer, press a couple buttons by yourself, watching a canned program, is employees view those as typically just checking the box. Not a good idea. Make the program interactive and get the employees engaged. It will make a big difference if you do that and you also make the program relevant to the workforce. Addressing harassment, not just sexual harassment, but any form of harassment. Sadly, there have been many reports of harassment involving vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, Republicans and Democrats in the workplace. These are things that need to be addressed, and many of my clients are having us address that in trainings that we provide. In addition, there's also been harassment of African Americans and also Asian Americans over the past several years, particularly Chinese Americans. So all of that should be addressed. Now, we want to define and build on our desired culture. The programs on harassment prevention aren't just about harassment, they are about getting to the culture, the goals we have, our core values, our mission statement, the things that drive us. And from the first interview that an employee has throughout the entire duration of the employment, make it clear to that individual what you expect of the individual and what the individual can expect of the organization. And then also think about expanding your harassment prevention training to bullying. Keep in mind that bullying can appear in physical, it could be verbal, it could also rear its ugly head in emails and text messages as well as posts online. Especially now that so much more is being done virtually, harassment has reared up in very different ways than it had in the past. And their perception, sadly, still a vast majority of employees perceive that it is unsafe to escalate a concern that they've got with their employment, whether it's harassment, bullying, discrimination, or something else. They feel it's unsafe. So when you message, and we've said this a couple of times about messaging, and from the first day of an interview going forward, focus on the perception through your actions and your words. Focus on the perception that you want employees to have, that you're doing all of this, you're doing this training because you want to make it an even better place to work, and that people truly care. Now, what I'm talking about is an initiative. It's going to take time, and it really never ends because some employees leave, other people are hired. So view this as a marathon and not a sprint. Take the time and put the energy into these programs. It will pay dividends. I can promise you that. Let's jump ahead. And now we're going to talk a bit about employee classification, and we're going to talk about equal pay. And what's happened is that with so many people working remotely due to the pandemic, a number of equal pay employee classification cases have arisen, and we've been dealing with things such as, for example, the employee is actually doing something very different from what the employee was doing when the employee was hired. So one of the things that we should be doing is doing checks to see if the employees who are classified as exempt are actually doing what was in the job description when the decision was made for that employee to be exempt. And the reality is that some of them may no longer be exempt. And misclassification can be incredibly costly. You might owe money for hours that were not compensated for overtime at time and a half. And if an action is brought, in some states, you can have triple damages. Plus, in addition to that, you would have to pay legal fees if the other party were to prevail, in addition to your own defense costs and then issues regarding employee engagement and potentially unwanted turnover. So here are two examples where the pandemic has impacted employee classification. One is outside sales. Sometimes we've got people whose job it is to spend the majority of the time out at customers, at prospects, at clients, selling. But because of the pandemic, they're not traveling. They may no longer be exempt from overtime. Another one is the exempt classification for a person who manages 2 or more people for a good chunk of the time. Well, they may not be managing anybody because they're working remotely. Again, you can run into employee classification issues. And the third are the independent contractors. We've had a couple of recent issues where people have come to us with questions about whether or not a person is an independent contractor or an employee. They've been with the company for a period of years. They do sporadic work, but they're doing oftentimes the same thing that the business does. Are they independent contractors or employees? If you get it wrong, it could be pretty expensive. So it's something that you definitely do want to address. Katherine, let's talk about equal pay and pay transparency.
Sure, thanks, David. There we go. All right, so I wanted to start this slide by using a specific example, and that's what's happening in New York City right now. The New York City pay transparency regulation is being implemented in an attempt to close the gap on pay inequality. Beginning in April of 2022, New York City-based companies with more than 4 employees must disclose salary ranges for all job postings. This applies to advertisements as well as for promotions or lateral transfer opportunities within the company. Not following the law would be considered an unlawful discriminatory practice and could result in a hefty fine of up to $125,000. But it's not clear yet if the law is going to apply to New York employers hiring for remote positions. So that's something to keep an eye out on. Last year, Colorado implemented the same requirement for employers to disclose the pay or pay range of a position in the job posting itself. There are several other states that have also instituted pay transparency rules and regulations. California, for example, has required employers to provide job applicants with the salary or hourly wage ranges for positions when the applicant asks for it, and that's been in place since 2018. Connecticut, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Washington have similar disclosure requirements. And Pennsylvania is considering a pay scale transparency law as well. Pay transparency aims to improve talent acquisition as well as fairness and employee retention. Studies have shown that pay transparency increases employee engagement, productivity, and overall job satisfaction. In my home state of Massachusetts, since 2018, employers have been prohibited from asking job applicants about their salary history before making an offer. This is very impactful because frequently the gender gap or the gender pay gap starts at the beginning of a career. If a woman is being paid less and then her future employer were to base the offer for her salary upon her historically lower salary, then that gender pay gap is only perpetuated. So this is another approach in moving towards equal pay. Women in Massachusetts are currently paid at approximately 84% of what their male counterparts make. The Massachusetts Equal Pay Act also prevents employers from prohibiting workers from discussing their pay with colleagues. So pay transparency and equal pay act are one way to try to curb equal pay claims. And David, could you tell us, maybe share with us some other tips for avoiding these types of claims?
Sure, thank you, Catherine. There's a day called Equal Pay Day, which typically occurs at the very end of March or very early April. And that's a day each year that women have to work to make as much as what men made in the prior year. It's still a big problem, and it's even worse for people of color, Hispanic, people, Native Americans. Um, so it is a real reality out there. Now, if an employee comes to you and they've got a concern regarding whether they're being paid equally, or that they haven't been paid for hours that they worked, that's a protected activity. And if they suffer any form of an adverse action within a short amount of time after that conversation, that could be a retaliation case. So please put that in the back of your mind. Now, the question is, how do you avoid equal pay claims? One thing is, it's important that on a regular schedule, whether it's once a year or every other year, take steps to audit based upon gender, audit based upon race, and determine whether or not two people who are similarly situated are being paid the same, or are they being paid differently. If they are not being paid the same, and the man is making more than the woman, the adjustment is, for example, in Massachusetts, as Katherine referenced, you must raise the women to the man's salary. You cannot do it the other way around. That's actually in the legislation. Another thing is that there could be reasons that are legitimate or bona fide why there's a pay disparity. They include things like geographic. If one person is in a rural area where cost of living is much lower than another person who's living in a city like, let's say, San Francisco, that could be a reason. Another reason could be there's heavy travel in a position, or a person's got a degree and certifications that are relevant for the position. But determine whether or not these bona fide exceptions are applicable. If they are, that's fine, but document it. If they're not, then take steps to correct the pay disparity. And that's very, very important. When you audit, one of the things I suggest is work with a law firm so you've got attorney-client privilege on the audit. Katherine, let's jump ahead now. And we had talked earlier about hire, and this is something that came about from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in conjunction with the Department of Labor's Federal Contract Compliance Program. And it's an initiative to expand access to good jobs to underrepresented people and to launch a number of initiatives. It will identify strategies to remove hiring barriers that limit opportunity along the lines of race, color, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ plus status, religion, disability, age, and veteran status. Katherine, do you have a sense of why they came up with this implementation?
Yeah, thanks for asking, David. So the EEOC indicated that the pandemic has hit some people of color, women, individuals with disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals, older workers, and others particularly hard. And this has compounded the impact of systemic barriers to hiring and advancement. And so they're trying to combat that. I did want to note really quickly, I know that we're running out of time here, but our economy is slowly recovering, continuing to add jobs, which is fantastic. But we're seeing that certain demographics do continue to face high levels of unemployment. So just quickly, for example, last month, the jobless rate for Caucasians was 3.2%. But for people of color, it was more than double that at 7.1%. And for Hispanics, it's hovering right around 5%. And we are still seeing gender disparity as well, which may be, partially due to increased caregiving responsibilities. But David, did you want to quickly hit upon some DEI initiatives before we thank our guests and say good day?
Absolutely. I noticed that there are indicates there are two questions in the chat box, but for some reason I'm unable to access it. Could you put the Q&A into the chat instead of the Q&A, and we'll try to get to your questions? Um, and, you know, on the issue of DEI, and I know that some companies get concerned because it sounds so ominous and so big and so expensive that they sometimes don't want to invest in it for those reasons. But I can tell you that the first thing you do is determine a focus. What's going on? Why do you think that there may be a benefit to a DEI program? And then it's possible to scale the initiative to what you can do. And as an initiative, as opposed to training, it can be spread out over time. But get top-down buy-in for the initiative. You want transparency and vulnerability. Once you've got that, then you can address things such as implicit bias. And as I mentioned earlier with training, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. But there are huge economic benefits to doing a DEI. The studies show that you can be as much as 35% more profitable if you do it. You have lower turnover, and at the same time, you're doing what is the right thing. I do see some of the questions, and I'll read them. Can you consider length of employment when comparing pay rates? We have a male in a position for 7 years and a female has been here for 6 months. Absolutely. If you've got a person with seniority and you've got a bona fide seniority program, then that could be a factor for a difference in pay. Another question is, will we be able to get a copy of the slides? Katherine, if you can jump to the last slide, please. Absolutely. You can certainly reach out to Katherine or to me, and we will be happy to send you the slides from the webinar. And if you want any of the materials that we've referenced, we'd be happy to send those to you as well. Katherine and I do what we do because we love our work. In fact, we don't even think of it as work. We think of it more as a calling. And we're very lucky to be able to do that and work with Marcia and the rest of our team at the Wagner Law Group. So if you've got questions or comments, if you want to brainstorm, reach out to either one of us, and we are more than happy to share our experiences with you. Marcia.
David, what a great job. Katherine, what a wonderful job. I just want to tell the audience that this is one of the best presentations I've ever heard about employment and HR updates. Thank you both so much. I just think hopefully, I know I got a lot out of this, and hopefully the rest of the audience did too. I can't imagine why not. I truly and fully encourage everyone to reach out to these consummate professionals, Katherine Brustowicz and David Gabor, and they're the best and they're the brightest and they're the kindest. So we at the Wagner Law Group are extraordinarily lucky to have this type of caliber of attorney who can provide services for your benefit. With that, David and Katherine, I turn it back to you to say goodbye, but in my opinion, bravo.
Thank you so much, Marcia.
Okay,
And thanks to everybody who attended today. We really appreciate your time and do hope that you learned a thing or two. And don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always here.